Hi, I'm Catherine Travis, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today Dr. Carmel O'Shannessy for this Abralin talk. This is one of several talks that we have had coming out of Australia as part of the Abralin series, and we're very grateful to Abralin for organising this series and giving us the opportunity to listen to scholars from around the world and vastly widen the range of research that we can be exposed to. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. Here in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal people, and we acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and region. Today, Carmel is talking about another Indigenous Australian community located far from here in the north of the country in what's known as the Central Desert. This is a Warlpiri community in a small town called Lajumanu, and she's going to talk about some really fascinating language change that has taken place in that community. Carmel is exceptionally well qualified for this work. She has some 20 years experience researching in the area. She was awarded her PhD in 2006, jointly from the University of Sydney, Australia, and the Max Planck Institute for Sociolinguistics in the Netherlands. And her PhD looked at language contact and children's bilingual acquisition in Indigenous Australia. From there, she went on to work for 10 years in the linguistics department at the University of Michigan, before returning to Australia to take up a position in the School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics at the Australian National University, where she now works. Here, she holds a highly prestigious Australian Research Council funded future fellowship for which she is examining early language, sign and gesture development of children speaking Aboriginal languages in Central Australia. Over her academic career, Carmel has published extensively on issues around Australian Indigenous languages in leading journals in linguistics. Her work has also been reported in news and science media outlets internationally since 2013, including the New York Times, the Huffington Post, Der Spiegel, Atlas Obscura, The Economist, and many more. But as well as this academic work, Carmel has also done an enormous amount of community work. Prior to beginning her academic career, she lived and worked for 6 years in Australian Indigenous communities, working in language and education in schools. In the Lajumanu community, she supported Warlpiri teachers teaching Warlpiri in the local school's bilingual education program. The value of this kind of community engagement for the research Carmel is doing cannot be understated, and it's this that allows her the kind of rich interpretation of the data she examines that you will see in her talk. Consistent with her commitment to language in Indigenous Australia, Carmel has also produced several non-traditional research outputs. This year, she co-produced a film with Warlpiri filmmaker Maxwell Walma-Tasman Japananka. The film, called Kaja Warnu Janka, meaning from the bush, is a unique biographical tribute to two senior Warlpiri men, Jerry Patrick Jangala, OAM, and Henry Cook Jakamara, who tell their own stories of their remarkable lives over 85 years. The video is accessible by Vimeo, and I encourage you to watch it. You can find it by searching for From the Bush. Carmel has also produced a series of audiovisual reports for teachers and community members who have not studied linguistics about children's Warlpiri in 4 communities, providing a vital research to teachers working with speakers of non-standard varieties of English without the tools or knowledge to be able to appropriately assess that. So you can see that Carmel has had a very interesting career that reflects her commitment to Australian Indigenous communities, both academically and socially. And I'll now hand over to her to share some of this work for her talk entitled Common Processes, Less Common Outcome.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for those kind words, and thank you to Miguel and Abralin for the invitation to speak in this series. Hello, everybody. Good morning and good evening. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Ngunnawal lands from where I'm speaking and of the lands of everyone participating in this talk today. My thanks especially to the people in Lajumanu community and the families of the children I've recorded over the years, including the list of people here, which includes my Warlpiri teachers, people who have worked with me in the research for many years, and people who have participated in the research, making it possible. For the structure of the talk, I'll first give you some background to Light Warlpiri, this mixed language spoken in this community in Australia. Then we'll look at some unilingual and bilingual language acquisition processes, and we'll look at the probable input to the children at the time of language change and how the children processed the input, and conclude with how quite common processes can lead to an uncommon outcome. Mixed languages themselves are an uncommon outcome of language contact processes. There are not that many in the world compared to the number of languages that there are in the world. And so that raises questions straight away about the kinds of processes that enable them to come about. Most research on these kinds of languages is about the result, how the source languages are distributed in the mixed language and the typology of the languages. There's been much less attention to the actual processes of how they come about. This is largely because mostly we find out about a language after it's conventionalized and become a linguistic system, and we're not able to observe it in the very early stages of that happening. But in this case study, we're able to get closer to the time of its emergence, and we're able to hypothesize some processes that might have taken place. In any situation where there's some kind of change in language, one generation must be speaking slightly differently or differently in some way from the way the previous generations were speaking. And so we want to know, how is that happening? Is there something different about the language processing and language cognition of a group of speakers who ultimately say something in a different way compared to the groups of speakers before them? Or is it the same kind of situation for all of that child generation everywhere, and that what is different is something about the sociolinguistic circumstance and the type of input that leads to a different outcome? Or in other words, are these processes of language and cognition qualitatively different in some settings from in other settings? So we'll address that question using the data from this case study. So the community of Lajamanu was established not so long ago, 1948 and 49, through forced relocation of Warlpiri people by the government. So you can see I've got an arrow pointing to Lajamanu there, and the other Warlpiri communities are some distance away from it. All of this area where my cursor is now is Warlpiri land, but in recent years since colonisation, people have been made to live in settlements such as these, and we can see that, I'm not screen sharing, oh my goodness. Okay, I'm terribly sorry about that. I wasn't screen sharing. I think you only missed some talking. So I think we can now just continue on as we were, but now the locations that I was talking about will make more sense. So I'll say that again. The community of Lajamanu is here in the Northern Territory of Australia, and the other Warlpiri communities are some distance from it, because the government moved people involuntarily about 70 years ago. All of this area is Warlpiri land, but now people have been made to live in settled areas rather than travelling across the land as they would have done traditionally for their own purposes. This will become very relevant later in the story about how this mixed language Light Warlpiri came about. For the study, I'm going to draw on data gathered over many years, naturalistic data of children and families interacting, narratives told from picture stimuli, and other types of elicitation data ranging from 2002. So first we'll just see some of the source languages to Light Warlpiri. So Warlpiri is a Pamanuyulan language and it has an agglutinating or suffixing structure.
Ninadal kolpalo walunga chandokolo palkakolo. Pota wachel pongo kodongo to chando chongula kango kongo.
It has an ergative absolutive system of case marking for core grammatical relations and a peripheral case marking system for other semantic relations. So the element there in bold is the ergative marker, just to point that out. Another source of Light Warlpiri is Creole, an English lexified Creole spoken across Northern Australia, which has different varieties. This is one variety.
Diyan baby, whenever one covered off, and I mean play caramel. And diyan monster, minkaman gulicap lang ato para.
So you can see that this is isolating, more like English in that sense. It's English lexified. And the points there in bold are the past tense marker been, ultimately from English been, but with a different structure here in the Creole. And the transitive marker on the transitive verb im on habum. And these are important to Light Warlpiri. So the situation in the community is that speakers over about age 40 speak Warlpiri, and they also speak other languages, for example, English, Creole to some extent, and often another traditional language. Speakers under that age, both adults and children, developed their own way of speaking, Light Warlpiri. They also speak English, which children learn as they grow up, and have familiarity with other languages, for example, with Creole and other languages in the region. So what is Light Warlpiri like? So what you can see there in the blue and italics is the suffixing structure of Warlpiri. And in the browny colour and plain font, you can see that the verbs come from Creole and English. So does the pronoun we. But we have there in green an innovative element, a new element that has come in that I'll talk about more, and which is important to the story of children's processing and the development of this way of speaking. So we can see that in Light Warlpiri we have a verb-noun split. We have the nominal structure of suffixing from Warlpiri, and we have verbal structure from Creole and English, plus the new element, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Notice that what we don't have here is the Creole past tense marker been. That is used a tiny bit in Light Warlpiri, but not very much. Instead, we have the new construction, which we see in wim and num. So the structure we see here is why we can say Light Warlpiri is a mixed language. A mixed language combines the grammar and lexicon of two or more sources in a very systematic and substantial way. It's not always a verb-noun split, but this is one way that languages can combine in what we call a mixed language. Another example of Light Warlpiri. So there again, you can see the new structure, which we see in num and wim, and there's no past tense been. You can also see the verbs come and go and the suffixing structure from Warlpiri. These two examples show the transitive marker on the verb, which comes from Creole, here with get 'em. And interestingly, in this example, we see that transitive marker on a Warlpiri verb stem. So although most verbs in Light Warlpiri are from Creole and perhaps English, there are also verb stems from Warlpiri that have been reanalysed, and if they're transitive, they have a transitive marker attached to them. So this verb in Warlpiri would be bandunu, and we can see that it's changed so that bandun creates the new stem in Light Warlpiri and this transitive marker attached. If this verb was in a Warlpiri sentence though, the auxiliary system would be completely different because it would be Warlpiri, not Light Warlpiri. We can also see here the ergative case marker from Warlpiri on the agent of the action. So if we put these together, this is part of the Light Warlpiri auxiliary paradigm, and we can see that it's very regular and very systematic. So we have a pronominal element and we have a temporal element. So the one that I've shown you so far is this line, the non-future, which includes present and past. And then we've also got future and want to or desiderative. So how did they come about? Well, it's fairly easy to see for some of them. If we take the line where we have ana, yuna, ina, if you think of English, I want to, and then said colloquially, I wanna. If you contract that down further from wanna and drop off the first consonant, then you get ana. Once you have ana, you can have ana, ina, yuna, dena, and regularize it. Same thing for the next one from English, I've got to, colloquial, I gotta. In Creole, this becomes gotta. Contract it down further and lose the first consonant, and you get ada. For the next one, there's a little bit more involved. I think it comes from a combination of surface forms. So the bin form, if you say bin really quickly, oven, you co-articulate the stop and the nasal so that you get And I think English I'm also plays a role here, because in English I'm we already have the prepositional element and the temporal or TMA element. And then this nasal is also present in im from him, third singular, and dem from them, third plural. So I think all of these play a role in coming up with this idea that we have a pronominal element and a temporal element, which is And the structural split in this marking in Light Warlpiri is non-future versus future, which is not the same structural split that we see in any of the sources, English, Creole or Warlpiri. So just to clarify, we went from a structure of we bin come to wim come. And this is intriguing and what we'd like to know more about. What were the processes in this coming about? It's unusual to see dramatic innovation within the verb system like this, and mixed languages themselves are uncommon. There are not that many in the world, and those with this kind of verb-noun structural split are even fewer. Two that we do know of that are similar in terms of having a verb-noun structural split to Light Warlpiri are Michif, which combines French and Cree in North America and Canada, and Gurindji Creole, which combines Gurindji and Creole, and is spoken in a community located quite close to Lajamanu, where Light Warlpiri is spoken. So thinking about the processes, it's widely accepted that mixed languages are created by bilinguals because the way that the elements of the source languages come into the mixed language is that those elements are fairly intact. You have, in a sense, chunks or structural chunks from each language. There is some innovation in some parts of many of the mixed languages, but largely the structures are fairly similar to how they were in the sources. So was it adults who code switched and then systematized that way of speaking, and then the next generation of children followed them? Or what roles did the adults and the children play? We don't usually have the kind of information needed to answer this question, but in this case, we do get much closer to having that information and are able to draw some insights into what may have happened. Now, I want to take a detour here and look at some of the things we know about language acquisition processes in bilingual and monolingual contexts, because we would want our thinking about the processes to be informed by what we know about these worldwide. We know that bilingual children mix their languages when they're very young. This is probably because they're still developing both vocabularies. They don't have all of the vocabulary yet in either language. Combined, they have a lot of vocabulary, and because of that, they tend to mix them. Some bilingual children even show a lexical grammatical split that we see in some mixed languages, where you have words from one language with grammatical structure from another. And they may show that at a very early stage in their development, but then they conform to both of the targets spoken in the community later. It's very well accepted now that young bilingual children, even if they mix languages, do differentiate them from early on and know that there are two linguistic systems. They, in doing this, might still show transfer from one language to another, and we've seen bilinguals develop new patterns based on reanalyzing or reprocessing the input. But if bilingual children grow up in a community of speakers where each language is spoken separately from the other language, they will grow up doing that too. And we know that adult bilinguals can be L1-like in each language, or they can also be close to L1-like with some degree of transfer. But they still are well able to speak each language separately in the separate environment, if that's how they are spoken in the speech community that they're in. If we look at first language acquisition, I'm just going to use some examples from English. What kids are really doing when they say cute things is they're figuring out how the language works. They're processing the input they receive, and they're looking for regularity. So on analogy from sing to sang, for example, a child might say brang, sing, sang, bring, brang, for a while before they later realise what the target in the community is. Or on analogy with the ed ending for ed for past tense in English, they might say bringed. And both of these occur in children's English, and then later they switch back. A similar type of example is nail polish me. So we can polish something, but nail polish is a noun. So here this child combined the idea of verb and noun for an innovative construction. This example is important to our analysis of Light Warlpiri, and it comes from the child is corpus.
Are you a cool great man to hold it?
I'm gonna hold it up.
Well, why would we leave it there? It's easier.
So this child said, "Anna, hold it up," meaning presumably, I want to hold it up. And that's how the parent interpreted it. So here we see something a little bit similar to what we've seen in Light Warlpiri with that contraction from wana to ana happening in English. And I'll come back to this. So what children do universally when learning their language is that they produce non-target constructions or constructions different from the adults during their language acquisition process. And then over time, the child works out the patterning that other speakers are using and changes it back and says things the same way that everyone in the community does. Regardless of what theory of child language acquisition a researcher is working with, the move from non-target to target typically happens. So let's go back to our case study now. So adults in Lajamano community worked on cattle stations in the area and in army camps, and there they were interacting with speakers of many different languages from across the north of Australia. There was an emerging Creole at that time called Creole that people used to communicate with each other. And adults code switched, so the Warlpiri speaking adults, for example, code switched between Warlpiri and the Creole, or Warlpiri and the English and the Creole. So I think that what happened was that when the adults were speaking to very young children, they code switched between Warlpiri and English and Creole in a very specific pattern as part of a baby talk register. And a baby talk register is a style that adults use when speaking to young children. Warlpiri already had a very clear baby talk register. And I think that what happened in this community is that adults brought into that register the pattern of code switching between Warlpiri and Creole, or Warlpiri and English and Creole. So I think it was something like this. Here we have a Warlpiri string with the Creole pronoun and verb with the transitive marker inserted into it, or in the next line, just the pronoun and verb. So these sentences were spoken by a speaker who's older than the Light Warlpiri cohort, but here she was speaking to a very young child. Now she speaks Warlpiri, but here she used this pattern to the young child. Here this speaker is speaking to another adult, but we see her pattern of code switching. So we see the Creole string abin come inserted into a Warlpiri string, and we see the bin past tense marker there. Here's a similar example. So here we see strings of Warlpiri first. The elements that are bolded are the verbs. So you can see this speaker is using Warlpiri verbs, and then he's also using the Creole verb and pronoun. What's interesting about this is that the past tense marker bin is not present. Now again, this speaker is older than the Light Warlpiri cohort. This is not a recording from the 70s and 80s when Light Warlpiri was conventionalized. It's a recording from much more recently, but this speaker is an older speaker. And what's interesting is this pattern of code switching that's being used. And this suggests that maybe the past tense marker bin wasn't always in the input. So maybe the children's non-use of bin when they conventionalize their own way of speaking was not such a big jump from the input that they were receiving. So the young children, this is going back to say the 1970s and 80s, the young children heard words and patterns from Warlpiri combined with English and Creole in a very specific pattern. And the past tense marker bin was only variably in the input. I think the children probably heard this way of talking very frequently and very consistently because it became the way of speaking to very young children. Now we know that children look for regularities in the input they receive. So these are some of the examples of what I think was the input that they were getting in Creole and in English. And if a child's looking for the regularities, they could find something like this, where you have a pronominal element and you have a temporal element, and then you have the verb. This structure was used when talking about something that had already happened, the past, and when something was happening now, the present. So this structure you can use for both present and past. And because bin was only variably present, maybe it just wasn't frequent enough to become part of this patterning. And we can see a quite clear regular pattern here as it is. So if the children then think that that is the pattern, and then they regularize it across the system, they just add in the you and we to the same pattern, And then you have the new structure and the new paradigm. And then we can see how that fits into the structure of Light Warlpiri, and in fact becomes this new way of speaking. Why do I think that children brought in this innovation? A couple of reasons. One is that the age group difference among the speakers is fairly clear. The age group that started speaking this way, that's now up to in their 30s and younger, they all use these new constructions, the yum and the wim, and so does everyone younger than them. But speakers older than them don't use those constructions. So I think that it must have been that age group that developed it, and then they pass it on to everyone else. But that by itself doesn't tell me when they developed it. So some evidence for the idea that it may have been children that brought in this new construction is when we go back to the wana ana contraction. So here we have an example of an English-speaking child saying ana for wana. And we can assume that in English, it didn't stick around. As far as I know, this is not a common construction in English. But we do know that it's the kind of reanalysis that an English-speaking child could make in their language acquisition processes. And the child who produced this was around 3 years old. I have heard other English-speaking children use this construction also at around the age of 3 years. And here it is in Light Warlpiri.
I want to get a baby, we wake up and go.
But of course, as we know in Light Warlpiri, it became part of the whole system. So we can see how you could go from wana to ana and create a regular system, ana, wina, yuna, dena. And we can also see that this is the kind of reanalysis that children do. Right? So in English, it didn't become part of the overall system for sociolinguistic reasons and some other reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. Whereas in Light Warlpiri, it did stay not just in one child's language, but in the language of the group of children and became part of their own way of speaking. And I think that that kind of reanalysis is very similar to the kind of reanalysis that we saw with the yum and wim construction. And we know that children look for regularity, and what they've done is created a very regular system that's actually only slightly different from the input that they were receiving. I think that there was also the influence of Warlpiri auxiliary clitic structure. Warlpiri has a TMA element and a pronominal element, and this is very regular throughout the system. They're in the opposite order, and the pronominal element follows the TMA element, but it may be that that structure had some influence on having a pronominal element and a TMA element in Light Warlpiri. Also, Mary Loughran has shown that semantically, the combinations of auxiliaries and verb inflections in Warlpiri can be mapped onto the semantic categories of Light Warlpiri. That auxiliary paradigm that I've shown so far is part of a larger paradigm, and there's the innovative section there. There are some other innovations, neban, which is past negative, which comes from neba bin, again contracted down, and you get that structure. And then there's another one, mada, which is you should, you mada, do it. So if we think about bilingual children and we know that they're able to keep their linguistic systems separate, then did the children who conventionalise Light Warlpiri keep the languages in their input separate? And the answer is yes, they did, because the input they were receiving was Warlpiri and a mixed system. They weren't receiving input in Warlpiri and then Creole and English. It was Warlpiri and a mixed system. They took the mixed system and they conventionalised it further and added the innovations, and they also learn and speak Warlpiri. So to recap, young children find patterns in what they hear. They adjust them or process them differently at some point. Most often they then adjust back to the way everyone else is saying it, but sometimes they don't adjust back and the new pattern catches on and everyone starts using it, which is what happened here. So we would want to ask, why did that happen here? Why is it that sometimes an innovation from child speakers spreads throughout the community rather than those children adjusting back to the community target? There are several reasons for this. There's the wider influence of English and Creole. The nearest town to La Germano is Catherine, and that's in a Creole-speaking area. And so people interact with Creole a lot. The forced relocation to this community means that the speakers living in this community are somewhat distant from the other Warlpiri communities. This road is sand and gravel, so in the wet season, it's not easy to travel down here. People do interact with the other Warlpiri communities a lot, but if we think back to before mobile phones, it would have been more difficult than it is now. Whereas the road up to the nearest town is mostly sealed, and so it's more convenient for lots of reasons to go in that direction. La Germano is also a small bounded community, and the children have a lot of individual autonomy. They're not told to speak in different ways. Young children spend a lot of time with other children, and maybe they wanted to speak like the other children. Speech accommodation, I think, would play a role, which is we often speak the way the person is speaking to us, not even deliberately. But if two people are speaking, they'll often start to say things the same way, and then that can catch on. There's a lot of creativity with language in the community. There are several registers and styles and ways of speaking. So being creative with language is not unusual. There was multilingualism in the community anyway. And importantly, the changes this group of children made was quite close to the input they were receiving. So to recap, adults talked in a particular way in a baby talk register. They were using more than one language in a sentence in a consistent pattern. The children did what children always do. They found patterns and regularities in what they heard, and they reanalysed them and made them more regular. And because of a specific combination of factors, like I just mentioned, and also the properties of the language in the input, this way of speaking spread and caught on within the community. Is this kind of thing completely unusual, or does it happen elsewhere? Well, there are other contexts where children lead contact-induced language change. Some Creole contexts have been documented, some Koines, where people speak different varieties of one language and then the next generation makes them more similar. Multi-ethnolex, which is spoken in major urban centres in Europe, where the children are interacting together and make some changes that are different from the input they're receiving from their parents, but the same as the other child speakers. In Nicaraguan Sign Language, children have made changes to the input they were receiving and kept those changes as they grew up. We see it in some examples of bilingual acquisition, and for example, in a variety of Spanish spoken on Rapa Nui. This idea should encourage us to think closely about the input systems of other contact languages when they arise. For example, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about what the language learning targets would have been for the earliest speakers of Hawaii Creole English. And Siegel and Roberts have shown very convincingly that the target languages for the first generation of children born locally there were their ancestral languages and an expanded Pidgin, not English, and not Pidgin alone. It's been argued also convincingly that for French and English lexified Creoles in the Atlantic area, for example, formal documented varieties of English and Creole were probably not the targets. People were probably speaking different varieties and more colloquially. And so the changes that came into the ways of speaking may have been closer to the actual targets than what we have sometimes thought. Children have been seen to regularise or make incremental changes to adult patterns in different language situations. And this kind of thing has been theorised as well in different situations. Arbo and Ansaldo have suggested that in a highly multilingual environment with low normative tendencies, an altered replication of the input is quite likely. So we would want to ask how and why is it quite likely? Well, I suggest the adults were mixing, the children reanalysed based on what they heard, but they produced something that was not especially different if you look at the child learner perspective, as we have in this case study. Mufwani, de Graaf and Arbo, for example, argue that children may select some of the adults' innovations and bring them into their own way of speaking and make them available for future learners. I would say they not only make them available, but they can conventionalise them within their own community of speakers. And Patrick McConville has argued for Australian language contact situations that young children are also getting linguistic input from other children. We shouldn't always be thinking of it as like parents and children. Children and teenagers might really want to model themselves on each other, not on the older speakers. And so it can be that a peer group can create the basis of a language for their generation. I would add to this that maybe the input was already not that far from what the children produced, even though what they produced was different in some way. As that group of children grew up, this way of speaking became part of their identity as young Warlpiri speakers in this one community. It shows partial language maintenance in the face of heavy pressure from English. So to address the question, what processes are involved when a new way of speaking emerges? In this case study, we've seen a two-stage process. Adults talk to young children in a consistent pattern, in this case, a code switching pattern. Children identified their own patterning from that, and then they regularised it a little further after reanalysing it so that they had a separate pronominal and temporal element. The new patterns caught on for several sociolinguistic reasons, and now there's a new way of speaking. So this case study presents an empirically grounded model of how a new way of speaking can emerge and the roles of both adults and children in that process. What we see is that the children's language processing was the same as we always see in bilingual and monolingual contexts worldwide, but that these common processes led, in this case, to an uncommon result. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmel, for a really fascinating talk. Okay, so I'm going to manage the questions from the chat and I'll pass them on to you. So there's a question here from Valdomiro Arantes. asking how many people speak Warlpiri. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more widely about language use in the community, number of speakers of Warlpiri, Light Warlpiri, the role of English and Creole in the community, or that these speakers might be exposed to put it in a slightly broader context.
Thank you for your question. Yes, so overall, probably about 3,000 people speak Warlpiri, and it's spoken in 4 communities that I showed on the map, and it's also spoken in towns and cities nearby. The community of Lajamanu only has about 700 people, and it's the only community where this change to Light Warlpiri has happened. In all of the other communities, children are growing up speaking Warlpiri as their first language. But in Lajamanu, these Light Warlpiri speakers grow up speaking Light Warlpiri and also Warlpiri, which they're learning along the way. Light Warlpiri is their primary language, but they're really learning and speaking both. They also learn English as they grow up, and they learn English at school. And then they also have a good awareness of other languages spoken around them. The situation with regard to Creole is interesting because although Creole is part of Light Warlpiri, people there don't really speak just Creole. What they do is they have parts of Creole in their Light Warlpiri. I think they know a lot about Creole, and some speakers have told me a lot about how people in neighbouring communities speak, but they know these ways of speaking, but they don't speak them themselves. So the idea of what a group of people speaks is very, very much tied to their identity and who they are. It doesn't necessarily represent their knowledge. They actually know a lot more about different ways of speaking, but those other ways of speaking, are not their way.
So Carmel, following on from that, what's their kind of metalinguistic awareness of this? Are they aware of Light Warlpiri? Is that something that they're familiar with, and do they know that it's different from Warlpiri and different from Creole, or how do they see this, and what's their sort of attitude to how do they feel about Light Warlpiri and their ways of speaking?
Yeah. The speakers themselves are very aware of it. Even very young children, like 5, 6, 7-year-olds, can tell you, oh, this is the way we say it in what they call Lajamanu style, or our style, and this is the way we say it. They call strong Warlpiri Yundamu style because they think of it as being spoken a lot in that community, and this is the way we say it in English. And they're very clear, and they can just change from one to the other. They think of their way of speaking as both Light Warlpiri and Warlpiri because they actually code switch between both of those. They very much see it as their own way of speaking, which it is. The attitudes towards it are much more complicated when we think of the attitudes of other people. I think for the Light Warlpiri speakers, it's fairly clear that they've got these ways of speaking, and when they want to interact with Warlpiri speakers, they change to Warlpiri. I think for older speakers, though, it's not as clear to them that it's really a linguistic system. Some people see that it is. Other people see it as mixing, and they don't think of mixing as a linguistic system. So I think there are different attitudes, and the attitudes are more complicated. But for the speakers themselves, it's quite clear that this is our way of speaking.
Okay. So then from the perspective of the analyst, how easy is it for you as you go through your transcriptions to identify what's Light Warlpiri and what's Warlpiri, for example, or do you sort of classify a whole conversation as Light Warlpiri? Because you've given us some features that identify Light Warlpiri, but I imagine there would also be some variability there, that these might not always be used. And so how do you sort of manage that as an analyst? It looks like very complex data to be working with.
If there's a verb in the utterance, it's easy to tell because a Warlpiri verb is quite different. It has a different form, and the Warlpiri verbal auxiliary is quite different.
Yeah.
So if someone has a Warlpiri clause, even if it's only the verb and the auxiliary, which you can have because core arguments can be elided, then that's clearly Warlpiri. And so similarly with Light Warlpiri, it's clear. Where it's not clear is if you have a non-verbal clause and you just have an utterance with a noun and case suffixing, for example, that fits both.
Mm-hmm.
So for instances like that, I do tend to look at sort of a whole series of sentences and see where the verbs are occurring, what kind of verb is it. But it does get pretty complicated because, as I said, people do code switch between these. And so then it's really a matter of identifying the verb to see which way of speaking we would call this, insofar as that is important.
Okay, good. Thank you. So Adrian Gustavo is asking if you have ever related this process to linguistic processes that affect the way the interne is different from other languages. I don't know that word. So if you can relate the process that you've observed to the linguistic processes that affect the way the language of, I guess, learners maybe is different from other languages. Sorry, I'm having trouble processing that. I'm going to post it in the chat to you, Carmel, and maybe you can.
But what I'm really arguing here is that all of the learning processes involved are the same as what we would see in any learning situation. Children do reanalyze the input they hear. It's not unusual for adults to code switch. What's different about this situation, and the reason a new way of talking came about, is that the sociolinguistic situation was different in being a very small, bounded community. And I think the fact that the children, I believe it's a fact, that the children received this kind of code switching in this specific pattern very consistently. And then the idea that the children modelled themselves on each other probably played a very big role. And the isolation, you know, this is our way of speaking in this community. So what I'm arguing is that the cognitive internal processes are the same, but what creates this different outcome is a combination of the sociolinguistic circumstances and also the type of the languages involved. For example, I'm not suggesting that English-speaking children would start saying "yum" and "whim" because they're not getting the kind of input that would cause a child to make that reanalysis. But given the kind of input that young children receive and how consistent it is, what they do with that input is the same as what children do with their input everywhere.
Thanks. Carmel, I've had a clarification. So it's not a highly technical term, it's a typo for internet. So the process of change that you're observing, how that might relate to the language, the ways in which the language of the internet is different from other languages.
That's an interesting question. One clear difference here is that the language of the internet doesn't really involve 2- and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. So there we're talking about adult language and cognition processes. Whereas what I'm talking about here is a 2-stage process where the adults were code switching and then the children acted upon that. So it is a different kind of a situation. I think it would be super interesting to follow that up and see are the kinds of changes that people make through contractions and abbreviations when communicating on the internet of a similar kind to what we see in spoken language situations and in these kinds of language context. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so thinking into the future, where do you see Light Warlpiri going? Do you see that these young speakers will continue to speak it and the next generation will speak it, or what do you see as for the future?
So the first generation, we should keep in mind that generations have an age range, right? Everyone's not, 39, but people are ranged across sort of 15 to 20 years. But if we take the first generation as sort of approaching 40 years now, the second generation are in their late teens, early 20s, and they have children now. And I've met some third generation Light Warlpiri speakers who are 1 year and 2 years old. It seems at the moment to be being transmitted in a very stable way. So those young parents are speaking to their children in the same way that they grew up, which is the way they were spoken to when they were young children and were growing up. So at the moment, it seems to be quite stable, and it seems to be continuing as our way of speaking in this community.
That's fascinating. So there's a question from Manuel Gonzalez, wondering if in interactions between Light Warlpiri and Warlpiri speakers, if there's ever accommodation from Warlpiri to Light Warlpiri as well. Wondering how categorical or fluid these identities might be in the nitty-gritty of actual communication.
That's a great question. I think I'm not sure if I can answer categorical or fluid. So the older speakers who are older than the Light Warlpiri cohort, they might speak all in Warlpiri, or they might code switch into English and Creole, and they might do both within the same conversation. But what's different is that they didn't learn as young children those innovative structures, so they wouldn't use those. But of course, the code switching in some ways is quite similar, because that was the basis for Light Warlpiri. So their accommodation would be to speak in Warlpiri and to code switch. The Light Warlpiri speakers also both speak in Warlpiri and speak in Light Warlpiri. But when they're speaking Light Warlpiri, it is this linguistic system, because they do have this systematic way of speaking and these innovations. But apart from that, it would look the same. So there is a lot of fluidity in ways of speaking, with code switching between Warlpiri and Creole, or Warlpiri and English, and then by the Light Warlpiri speakers, Warlpiri and Light Warlpiri. And they, of course, can switch into English as well.
Carmel, what would you say would be the implications of this study for other kinds of contact or other kinds of language change situations?
I think the main implication is that when we see something that from a linguistic structural point of view looks quite new and like quite a big change, like from you bin to yum, we perhaps could think maybe it's not such a big change from the point of view of the speakers who made the change. And I think some of us have tended to assume that we know what the targets were that those speakers were aiming at. But if we're able to find out more about what the targets were, we might find out that actually that wasn't what they were. Like when you see Light Warlpiri and you see that it combines Warlpiri and Creole and English, you might think, oh, the children were receiving input in those languages and they combined them. But when we look more closely, we see that the adults were already combining them and the children were receiving input in Warlpiri and a mixed system. So what we can learn is to look more closely at what the probable input was, and then see if perhaps what seems like a big structural leap is actually more of an incremental change of the kind that children always make. And finally, on that question, I would just say that maybe what the children are doing in language contact situations where there's change in process is nevertheless what children always do, and not something that's qualitatively different.
So do you think that there's always going to be a role for children in leading contact-induced change, or what particular settings would you say might be more ripe for that?
I'm certainly not suggesting that this would always be the case. For example, there's a lot of convincing evidence that adult second language learning plays a strong role in the formation of Creole languages, for example. So I think what this suggests is looking very closely at the actual sociolinguistic background of the specific situation and figuring out what was most likely to happen and getting as much information about the situation as you can so as to be able to work that out. So things like a small bounded community like this one, children interacting a lot with each other and perhaps wanting to model themselves on each other would play a strong role. If you have a different kind of community, you might expect different kinds of outcomes.
Okay, well, great. Well, I think that's the set of questions that we've had. So I think we'll wrap it up and leave it there. And thank you again for such a fascinating talk. There have also been some very positive comments on the chat about the talk.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Abralin.
Yes.